Hi, students. Let's do a little review. We began this course by talking about the nature of graphic design, definitions of graphic design, the implications of graphic design in relation to the art world in a general sense, and then we talked about the beginnings of graphic design, and that's where I'm starting today. So the very first graphic design, or what we until recently thought must likely be the very first example of human-made graphic design, was a little clamshell with some zigzag scratch marks on it. And because the zigzag scratch marks looked pretty consistent and apparently intentional at some level, we described it as an act of design, enhancing the natural form and shape of the shell with complementary rhythmic mark making. That happened about 500,000 years ago in Indonesia, at least, perhaps later elsewhere, but if it happened as early as 500,000 years ago in Indonesia, it stands to reason that someone was doing something similar to that a good deal earlier in South Africa, where modern hominins and their predecessors, the earlier hominins, first arose. We then moved way forward to Homo sapiens ourselves. We are a late species, the last and surviving one of the hominin family. And this example from a cave in South Africa called the Blombos Cave was the next thing I talked about. It was a small piece of ochre, that's a soft, warm, brownish, reddish, yellowish stone, on which, as you can see, even in this tiny little reproduction, were made a sort of zigzag or X series of marks. So again, we have something which was apparently intended to enhance the appearance of an object, which in this case was very utilitarian. It was some kind of tool for running thread through, or perhaps something else, but clearly made and used for a while by someone. Then I jumped way forward to talk about much more specific and identifiable ways of making marks, which is to say, performing graphic design, making marks with intentionality of some kind, usually to communicate better the meaning of something, a message. This is the Venus and Sorcerer image from Chauvet Cave in the Ardèche region of France. It is something we discovered only about 25 years ago, and which upset the dating system in paleontological art history, forcing people to set back the date of Mesolithic art, which is to say art which seems to indicate the makers of it were aware of and trying to reflect their awareness of humanness, in addition to representing animals as they had been doing for some time before that point. This being the difference between paleontology, or Paleolithic art and Mesolithic art. And this being Mesolithic art, one assumed it was much later in time than it turned out to be. This is something that's been a pattern over the last 30 years or so, finding more and more objects on Earth that set our dating back further and further. So what you're seeing here is a line drawing, contour line drawing representing female and male. At least that's the predominant hypothesis, though certainly no one knows when it comes to cave art and prehistoric art by definition, because it does not have the story attached. So we must make that up ourselves. Much later, about 8 or so 10,000 years later, the Great Hall of Bulls in Lascaux Cave in France, not far away, returned us to an earlier point in the development of Homo sapiens art, representing, again, in contour line, skewed perspective representations, animals exclusively rather than humans and animals. Moving on to the Neolithic period, these dates you'll see overlap, because this is a much more recent example of cave art, only discovered a few years ago on East Kalimantan in Borneo. We're looking at Neolithic art of human figures dancing, apparently, or flying, perhaps. But the dates precede those of the much, much earlier developmental stage represented by the Lascaux animal painting. So this tells us that at different points in time, different groups of humans were at different states of development of their social visual culture. Then, as a final example, discovered in 1907, that shouldn't be there, discovered in 1907, but actually dating from around, let's say, 9,000 to 6,000 years ago, the Neolithic and quite dramatic and stylish graphic design representations of animals and their hosts and entertainers, the humans, as well as their hunters in some scenes, at a place called Tasli Ajr in Algeria. Now, all of that I've included in our graphic design course because they are technically graphic designs and because we don't know what their purpose was. For example, when we think of graphic design now, we generally think that it's the use of imagery as well as the designed use of written language forms to communicate clear meaning of a narrative type that might be unrelated to the visual culture that is promoting it. So we're looking at two different ingredients in graphic design: the making of the imagery, which is usually based on writing as well as other forms of imagery, including isotypic illustration, etc. And the purpose to which that imagery is put, which is often very, very different from the image itself and the language itself. So a good example would be to sell a product, right? But if you look at this kind of art, prehistoric art, like this one in the middle, the Great Hall of Bulls imagery of the speckled bull in Lascaux Cave, we don't know what the purpose was. And of course, we can assume with some reason that it was a sort of spiritual image base paying tribute to, say, some kind of spirit of the bull, the great speckled bull spirit in the sky. We just don't know. That is a reasonable hypothesis because, of course, later groups of humans about whom we know more seem to bear out this tendency among early groups at certain stages of their social development, focusing on animals as talismanic figures representing spirits. On the other hand, it could easily have been a description of what was for dinner. And if that's true, then we're not very far, are we, from a Campbell's soup commercial? I'm not being entirely facetious. So then we moved into the earliest points in the history of graphic design, and I started with the Palette of Narmer, which is not only the first work of graphic design we have in historical time, but also the first work of visual art in general that we can definitely and confidently place in history. And the reason is because it is so clear. It tells its story so clearly and logically. It represents the human figure in a variety of scales, which is makes it easy for us to understand who is most important, who is less important, who is least important in the scenes. It tells us that person's identity, not only by the costume he wears, but also by his name, which is actually spelled out in hieroglyphs above his head. And it tells us what he did and why he did it. It shows Narmer clobbering his enemy, and then on the other side, you might remember, unifying the two Egypts, one formerly ruled by the clobbered enemy and the other presently ruled by Narmer, to fuse them into a single united state of ancient Egypt along the Nile. It's remarkably eloquent in its use of simple contour line drawing imagery, even though it's bas-relief sculpture. Likewise, the hieroglyphic language, written language system, the writing system of the ancient Egyptians tells a story. It tells a story not only through illustrations of nouns, objects and subjects in statements, sentences, and paragraphs, but it also tells us verbs, adjectives, adverbs through the homophones, or the words that sound like those nouns, so that feathers, for example, might sound in ancient Egyptian like run or hop or skip or jump. I'm just making this up, of course. And that connection, once made among the Egyptians, formed the basis for a very swift and efficient means of communicating important information through writing. It also retained and expressed a rather extraordinarily sophisticated ancient visual cultural tradition. So the taste, the aesthetics or standards of beauty associated with and shared among Egyptian graphic designers, scribes as they were called then, um, were communicating meaning, but also cultural priorities, visual cultural priorities among the people, so that within a few hundred years of the development of hieroglyphs, we had a culture that shared a very wide base of images, designed images that they could use to communicate more than just the literal meaning of texts, but also some of the identity of the Egyptian people. Um, Another example, in ancient Egypt, the rise of a cursive script, a kind of quick, but sometimes very beautifully executed cursive or handwritten connected letter language, which is still hieroglyphic in its foundation, but which has been shorthanded into what appears to most people to be a rather complicated alphabetic handwritten writing system. Then we moved to ancient Sumer, and we looked at the early development in the same period as the development of the palette of Narmer in the late 4th millennium BCE, the development of clay tablets with cuneiform writing on them. And this was a similar source, we think, although we have nothing earlier than the earliest of these cuneiform language records. We assume, because many of the cuneiform images look a little bit like representations of things, as in the hieroglyphs from Egypt, we assume that there is an earlier hieroglyphic stage, but that none of that survived. Once they started recording their simple messages on registers and pressing them into wet clay using a wedge-tipped tool, we have cuneiform, which means wedge shape or wedge form. And these then gradually developed into a much more elaborate and eloquent language system. First, we see it in, and that's again the wrong date there. I don't know why it says 1907, honestly, but it's around 27 to 2500 BCE, and these are the so-called Blau monuments, B-L-A-U monuments, which start to record important facts and accompany them with illustrations to support their meaning. And that is going to reach its zenith in the next millennium, around 1750, with the stele or stela of Hammurabi, one of the great classic objects in the history of graphic design. It's a large, hard stone, about, I don't know, 6 feet, 7 feet tall, as I recall, but I could be wrong. I saw it once when I was much younger in the British Museum, where its current residence is. This is a large stone recording in great detail in written language the basic jurisprudence, the law system of the ancient Babylonians of the Akkad regime. And at the top of that, although you don't see it in our little detail, you'll remember it from class, you see Hammurabi, the governor or king, whatever, of the people, who is receiving the scrolls, presumably the very ones that are illustrated below or that are recorded below, from a god seated on a throne. Then we move to the late ancient period. So I made lots of jumps. We're only trying to make some general points here about the development of human visual culture as it relates to communicating through written language accompanied by enhancements of design. This is Sophilos' signature on the far left from an ancient Greek pot of the what we call the archaic period. It's really the beginning of the classical period for pot making and pot painting. And it's just to show you that already there is the appropriation or the ownership of written language by members of society. Individuals begin to take charge and use the language for their own purposes, not only as functions of political power within a court, as was the case in Egypt, or as records for a spiritual leadership, as in ancient Sumeria. And then I showed you here in incised relief the all caps, all square ancient Greek record keeping carved into a votive. This is a rock or stela that's been carved into, which was placed at a gravesite. So it's essentially a kind of a tribute to the gods who might receive the deceased. And as you can tell, we have something very similar to what you see 2 steps over to the right in Trajan's column, the detail from the great column of Emperor Trajan from the earliest years of the empire of ancient Rome, which is a good 350 years after the ancient Greek example we see to the left. In between, I put an example of simple demotic or casual, informal record keeping using the ancient Greek alphabet. And this is from Timotheus Persians or Persei. On the far right, you can see the Sinaitic Codex, as it's called, which is a good example of Byzantine Latin writing in what is uncials. So uncials meaning inch highs, or thumb highs, as in the first phalanx of a thumb. We're looking at a kind of regulated standard means of communicating parts of a language in written form. And that begins with the Greek and continues with the Latin alphabets. Half uncials are next, and by this time we've exited the ancient Roman period, we're well into the Byzantine era, and we've moved west for our example to Great Britain, where we're looking at half uncials from the famous Book of Kells, one of the glories of early medieval graphic design history. It's a big book that contains the Gospels, or at least parts of the Gospels. It is of tremendous, incalculable value to the Irish people. It's one of the great treasures of Ireland. It's on exhibit in a more or less permanent way in Dublin, where it is shown in one or another page spread every week, changing. You can see the design system at work in that little detail there. The idea of half uncials preceded where necessary by important letters, often on what we call carpet pages, which are the large front pages of chapters or verses from the Christian texts, which were copied out by monks devoted to the Christian faith, but raised within the pre-Christian pagan culture of Great Britain, hence incorporating, as you can see from the second from the left image and the third from the left image, the center image, incorporating pre-Christian nature worship-oriented imagery as design elements in graphic designs that enhance the Christian gospel texts. Third, from the right, is an example of an even later stage in medieval art history, when we see graphic design used to enhance a myriad of texts. In this case, a story about the birth of Jesus and the 3 wise men coming to pay tribute on, as it turns out, multicolored and beautifully color matched horses, pink, yellow, and blue. And what you're seeing is the use of color for complementarity's sake, using color in a strategic way, the 3 primary colors we could call them today, enhanced and offset by a kind of complementary or near complementary capes worn by the 3 wise men or 3 kings who are on horseback. All of this meant to enhance the written text, which I didn't include in this little inset photo, from St. Alban's Psalter. This is 1100s in what we now call the Romanesque period.